There are families whose secrets are buried deep within the walls of their homes, hidden away from the world and guarded fiercely by the shadows of time. But no one could have predicted the chilling truth about the Devereux family, a truth that would unravel everything they thought they knew about their past. It was the summer of 1982 when rumors first began to swirl around the Devereux family. The family, known for their secluded lifestyle, lived in an old Gothic mansion at the edge of town. The locals rarely saw them, but there were whispers that they never left the house, that they were a family shrouded in mystery, and that there was something deeply unsettling about their existence. The mansion itself seemed to have a life of its own, its towering spires casting long, dark shadows across the overgrown garden. The Devereux family kept to themselves, never attending town meetings, never socializing with the other families. The townsfolk who had once been friendly with the Devereux ancestors had grown uneasy. After all, it's not every day that a family refuses to venture out, only to be seen behind closed windows, their faces mere silhouettes against the yellow light of the candles within. But the most unsettling aspect of the Devereux family's behavior was the darkness that seemed to surround them. It wasn't just their avoidance of the outside world that troubled the townspeople. It was the way the family had isolated themselves from everything, including the most basic human connections. No phone calls, no visitors, not even a single letter that reached the outside world. The family was as invisible as the mansion itself, hidden behind layers of darkness that no one dared to disturb. It wasn't until the summer of 1983 that a curious group of teenagers, having heard the rumors and sensing an opportunity for adventure, decided to sneak onto the Devereux estate. They had always been told that no one went into the mansion, that it was too dangerous, too mysterious. But for them, the idea of unraveling the secrets of the family was irresistible. The teens made their way through the tall iron gates, the rusted metal creaking as they pushed them open. The mansion loomed ahead, an imposing structure that looked as though it hadn't seen sunlight in years. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as if time itself had stopped at the threshold of the estate. The teenagers hesitated, their hearts pounding in anticipation of what they might find. They tiptoed through the overgrown courtyard, careful to avoid the old fountain that had long since dried up. The house was dark, its windows blackened with grime, but faint light flickered from beneath the door. A sliver of golden light spilled out, and for a moment, the teenagers thought they heard a voice, soft, almost inaudible, coming from within. Curiosity overpowered their fear. They crept inside, pushing open the creaky door that seemed to resist their every movement. Inside, the air was thick and musty, the scent of dust and decay hanging in the stale atmosphere. The house felt alive in a way that was both eerie and suffocating. As they ventured deeper into the mansion, the darkness enveloped them and the silence became oppressive. It wasn't until they reached the grand staircase that they discovered the first clue that something was horribly wrong. A door, slightly ajar, revealed a room hidden from view, a room that should not have existed. In the dim light, they saw what appeared to be a library, but unlike any library they had ever seen. The bookshelves were crammed with old tomes, their spines covered in dust. But the most disturbing thing was the thick layer of cobwebs that covered every surface. It was as if the room had been untouched for decades, left to rot in the dark corners of the house. But as they stepped into the room, something caught their eye. A chest, old and weathered, sitting in the far corner. It was strangely out of place, as though it didn't belong in this room. As one of the teens, Daniel, approached the chest, his fingers trembling with excitement and fear, he noticed something odd. The chest had an inscription carved into its surface, one that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. The inscription read, "For the light shall never reveal what is hidden within." Without thinking, Daniel reached for the chest, his hand shaking as he gripped the rusty latch. With a deep breath, he opened. Inside they found something they never expected, a collection of old letters, their edges yellowed with age. Each letter was carefully sealed in wax, and the handwriting was elegant, but the words written inside were chilling. The letters spoke of the Devereux family's history, of a dark secret that had been passed down from generation to generation. As the teens read the letters aloud, they began to piece together a story that no one had ever dared to speak. The Devereux family had been cursed. The letters, a curse that had been placed upon them generations ago, a curse that kept them bound to the darkness they so desperately tried to escape. The curse had begun with the family's patriarch, a man named Edward Devereux, who had made a terrible mistake many years ago. In his greed, he had stumbled upon a forbidden secret, one that should never have been uncovered, and in doing so, he had opened a door to something far more sinister than he could ever have imagined. The family's isolation was not a choice, but a necessity. They had been trapped in a cycle of darkness, unable to break free from the curse that haunted them. The letters spoke of ritualistic sacrifices, of lives lost, and of a shadow that followed the Devereux family wherever they went. As the teens read, they realized that the darkness surrounding the family was not just a metaphor. It was a literal force that had consumed their lives, one generation after another. And the worst part, the last letter, the one written by the youngest Devereux, revealed a shocking truth. The curse was not just a family secret, it was a warning. The mansion had claimed them, and it would claim anyone who dared to uncover its hidden truth. The teens stood in silence, their faces pale as the gravity of what they had uncovered sank in. They had uncovered the Devereux family's darkest secret, and now they understood why no one had ever dared to live in the mansion again. It wasn't just the house that was cursed, it was the family, and anyone who came too close would become part of the tragedy. But the mystery didn't end there. As they left the mansion, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the shadows of the Devereux family were following them, waiting for the moment when they would return. And that's when the true horror began. The night the teens left the Devereux mansion, they didn't just carry a handful of old letters, they carried the weight of a curse, something far darker than they could have ever imagined. At first, they thought it was all a wild, unsettling adventure, but as the days passed, strange things began to happen, and their innocent exploration morphed into a nightmare. It started with Daniel. The first night after their visit, he lay awake in his bed, his mind racing with the things he had read in the letter. He couldn't shake the image of the chest, the letters, and the strange inscription that had almost seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. Sleep, which usually came so easily to him, had become an elusive luxury. His eyes remained wide open, staring into the dark of his room, as his thoughts spun in a never-ending cycle. The silence of the night had become too loud, a deafening presence that seemed to press in from all sides. And then he heard a soft sound, barely audible at first, like a whisper or perhaps the flutter of paper. He sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound came again, more distinct this time. It was coming from the closet. Daniel slowly swung his legs over the side of his bed, his feet touching the cold floor as he stood. The house was still too still. His room, once a comforting place, now felt like a prison. With slow, deliberate steps, he made his way to the closet door. The whispering continued, faint but persistent. As he reached for the handle, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The air grew thick, heavy with an unnatural chill. He pulled the door open. Nothing. Just clothes hanging in a row. Nothing unusual at all. The whispering stopped immediately. Daniel stood frozen, staring at the empty space inside the closet. A sense of dread washed over him, the kind of fear that grips you in the pit of your stomach and refuses to let go. He backed away, shaking his head. It had to be his imagination. There was no other explanation. But from that moment, the strange occurrences began to escalate. It wasn't just Daniel. Over the next few days, each of the other teens began to experience unsettling things. Margaret, the quietest of the group, started having vivid nightmares. In her dreams, she would find herself standing in the mansion's grand hallway, the walls lined with portraits of the Devereux ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. She would feel an overwhelming presence, as though something was watching her, and she would wake up in a cold sweat, the feeling lingering even after she was fully awake. James, the skeptic of the group, tried to dismiss it all as coincidence. He convinced himself that they were simply victims of their own imagination, products of reading too much into the mysterious letters. But when he found himself alone one evening, the lights flickered in his house, and his phone screen cracked for no apparent reason. The eerie feeling of being watched grew stronger each day, and soon he found it impossible to ignore. No longer able to rationalize away the events, James became obsessed with understanding what was happening. There was one constant. Every time the teens spoke about the mansion or the Devereux family, something would shift. Their surroundings seemed to darken, the air thick with a suffocating sense of dread. The letters, as much as they had tried to dismiss them, held the key. It wasn't just a family secret that had been buried in the past. It was a warning, one that none of them could avoid. Driven by fear and a desperate need for answers, the teens returned to the mansion. The letters had spoken of a hidden room, a secret passageway that only the Devereux family knew about. The feeling of the house pressing down on them grew stronger with each visit, but they could no longer ignore the pull to uncover the truth. They arrived under the cover of nightfall, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like tiny beacons of hope. This time the house was different. It seemed to resist their presence, as if the mansion itself were alive and fighting to keep them out. The front door, which had always creaked open easily before, was now stuck, unwilling to budge. They struggled with it, but it wouldn't give. The only way in was through the broken window at the side of the house, just as they had entered on their first visit. Cautiously, they climbed through the window one by one into the darkness of the grand foyer. The smell of decay was even more overpowering than before, and the house seemed to groan under the weight of its age. The once grand staircase stood before them, its wooden steps dark and polished, but a sense of foreboding clung to the air. They moved through the house, retracing their steps from before, but this time with more purpose, more determination. Their goal was simple: find the hidden room, the one mentioned in the letters, the room that had been sealed away for generations. The house seemed to guide them, as though it were meant to show them the way. When they reached the library, they noticed something they had missed before. There, behind the row of bookshelves, was a narrow door, hidden from sight. It was nearly impossible to see, but when Daniel placed his hand on the wall, the door creaked open, revealing a passageway. As they entered, the temperature dropped, and a strange energy seemed to pulse from the walls. The passage led to a basement, far deeper and colder than any part of the house they had explored. As they descended, the sound of the wind outside grew muffled, and they realized that they were far underground now. At the bottom of the stairs they found a door, rusted and locked, but the lock was old, and with a little force they managed to break it open. Beyond the door lay a room, unlike any they had ever seen before. The walls were covered in strange symbols, some etched into the stone, others painted in deep red. But as they read further, a chilling realization hit them. The ritual didn't just preserve the Devereux family, it cursed every generation. Each heir, bound by the blood of the previous, became a prisoner of the family's dark legacy. They were shackled to this twisted pact, unable to escape the horrors of their ancestors' deeds. And the children, they weren't just sacrificed, they were trapped, their souls bound to the very house that had claimed their lives. Their spirits could never leave. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped even further. It felt as if the very walls were closing in around them. The teens could feel something ancient and malevolent stirring beneath the floorboards. It was as if the house itself had come alive, reacting to their presence, aware of their discovery. "We have to get out of here," Daniel whispered, his voice tight with fear. But as he turned to leave, the door to the hidden room slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. The walls seemed to pulse, and the air grew heavy, as if the house was refusing to let them go. Panicking, they scrambled to find another way out. James tried to pry open the door, but the metal handle was hot to the touch, as though something had been heating it from the other side. As he backed away, his flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The only source of light now was the dim glow of their torches, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. Suddenly, a loud scraping noise echoed from above. It was a sound like nails against stone scraping and scratching, growing louder by the second. The teens froze, their blood running cold as they listened. The sound was coming from above the ceiling. Slowly, ever so slowly, they raised their torches toward the rafters. The beams creaked and groaned as something heavy shifted in the attic above them. Then, out of nowhere, the whispering began. It started soft, almost inaudible, but as they strained to listen, the voices became clearer. It wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of whispers, overlapping, murmuring in a language they couldn't understand. The words seemed to drip from the walls themselves, seeping into their minds. Margaret clutched the book tightly to her chest, trying to block out the voices, but no matter how hard she tried, the words filled her ears, drowning out her thoughts. "It's them," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "The spirits of the children. They're trying to tell us something." The others stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. And then they saw it. A shadow, small and fleeting, darted across the far corner of the room. A child's silhouette, barely more than a wisp of darkness. The figure paused in front of them, its eyes empty voids of blackness. The whispering grew louder, and the child slowly raised its hand, pointing at the altar. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The teens stared at the figure, their hearts racing in their chests. It was as if the child was asking them to understand something, to see what had been hidden in the house for centuries. But before they could react, the shadow disappeared, vanishing into the darkness. The house groaned again, and the door to the hidden room creaked open. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, but the feeling of dread remained. They didn't need to be told twice. They ran, not looking back, not daring to stop. Until they were safely outside the mansion, their hearts pounding in their chest. They had uncovered the truth, but what would they do with it? The Devereux family had been living a lie, one built on generations of bloodshed and sacrifice. And now, that lie had found its way into the hands of those who had no idea of the darkness they had awakened. As they made their way back to the town, their minds were still reeling from what they had discovered. They had come to the mansion to uncover a mystery, but what they had found was far worse than anything they could have imagined. The Devereux family's curse was real, and now, it was too late to stop it. The darkness had followed them. The town of Windermere had always been a quiet, sleepy place, nestled between towering trees and winding rivers. The small village had long been untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Life had a comfortable rhythm here, where the biggest concerns were the harvests, the weather, and the occasional local scandal. But that all changed the day the teens uncovered the Devereux family's horrifying secret. After leaving the mansion, the teens could barely sleep. They huddled together in their rented rooms, the weight of their discovery hanging over them like a dark cloud. None of them dared to speak too much about what had happened in that cursed room. The whispers of the children, the haunting eyes of the shadowy figure, they couldn't escape them. Their minds raced, but they found no comfort in discussing it. They had no answers, only questions, and the fear of the truth left them paralyzed. Margaret was the first to break the silence. Her hands shook as she sat up in bed, holding the tattered book they had found in the mansion's attic. The pages were worn, the ink fading, yet they still felt unbearably heavy. The words they had read in that room were alive in her mind, crawling beneath her skin. She couldn't shake the feeling that the book had a connection to something much darker than she had ever imagined. "We need to do something," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the night. "We can't just walk away from this." James, who had been sitting by the window staring out at the mist-covered town below, turned to her. "What do you mean, do something?" "It's too late for that. We already know too much. If the family ever finds out we have this..." His voice trailed off, his eyes narrowing with fear. "We're not safe." Daniel, ever the skeptic, shook his head. "We should have never gone in there. This whole thing, it's cursed. The book, the spirits, the ritual, it's all part of the family's sick history. What if we just forget it, walk away and never look back?" But Margaret could feel the weight of their discovery pulling her deeper into the mystery. They had uncovered something so sinister that the very fabric of the town seemed to have been woven with lies, blood, and unspeakable rituals. They had come to understand that the Devereux family wasn't just wealthy. It was built on a foundation of unimaginable cruelty, and that foundation was now threatening to consume them. "What if they're still alive?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "What if they've been hiding in plain sight all this time, waiting for someone to uncover the truth? And now that we know, they won't let us go." Her words hung in the air, the room growing colder with the weight of their implications. The teens knew she was right. They had opened the door to a world of darkness that they could never close again. The Devereux family's curse wasn't just history. It was a living, breathing thing, and it had been passed down through generations like a sick inheritance. As the days passed, the teens tried to go back to their lives, but nothing felt the same. The once peaceful town of Windermere now felt suffocating, as if the shadows of the mansion followed them everywhere they went. Everywhere they looked, there seemed to be signs of the family's lingering presence, like ghosts watching from the corners of their vision. Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the book. The ancient text was filled with dark passages, describing the family's rituals, their desire to remain immortal, and their reliance on the blood of innocent children to maintain their power. But the most chilling part of the book was the final entry, the one that described the Devereux family's pact with something much older than any human could comprehend. It was a deal with an entity that had existed long before the family's ancestors had even set foot on this land. The family had made a bargain, one that involved blood sacrifices and promises of eternal life. In exchange for their immortality, the Devereux were bound to serve this ancient force, feeding it with the souls of their children. It was a pact made in the darkest corners of history, a deal that ensured the family's reign would never end, so long as they kept the bloodline intact. As Margaret read further, her hands shaking with disbelief, she found something even more terrifying, a warning. The book spoke of an ancient ritual, one that could break the curse and end the Devereux family's reign of terror. But it came at a price. To break the curse, the family would need to sacrifice the very thing that had given them their power, their bloodline. The teens' hearts sank. If they were to stop the Devereux family from continuing its deadly cycle, they would need to erase everything the family had built. They would need to break the bloodline for good, destroying the very foundation of the family's existence. But that meant confronting the family head-on, and knowing what they had discovered, there was no doubt in their minds that the Devereux would stop at nothing to protect their dark legacy. The next day, the teens decided they had no choice but to go back to the mansion. The curse was too powerful to ignore, and they knew that they couldn't rest until the truth was exposed and the family's hold on Windermere was broken. The mansion, now abandoned and crumbling, held the key to ending the Devereux legacy forever. As they stood outside the gates once more, the wind howled through the trees as if warning them to turn back. But there was no turning back now. The secrets that had been buried for centuries had found their way into the light, and there was no going back to the way things were. The teens walked toward the mansion with determination in their hearts. They had no idea what awaited them inside, but they knew one thing: they had to end the Devereux curse, no matter the cost. The mansion stood before them, its looming silhouette distorted against the cloudy sky. The iron gates creaked in the wind, groaning as if warning them to stay away. But it was too late for second thoughts now. Margaret, James, Daniel and the others knew they had no choice but to face whatever awaited them inside. The day they had discovered the hidden book had been filled with dread, but the truth they had uncovered only deepened their resolve.
The Devereux family wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a malignant force, still very much alive. The dark rituals, the bloodline, the curse, it all made sense now. They had to stop it before it consumed more lives, and the price for breaking the curse could be steeper than any of them had imagined. They entered the mansion once again, this time with purpose. The house had a dark aura, the kind that could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. Every step they took echoed through the vast halls, the silence thick and suffocating. The air smelled old, dusty and stale, like years of neglect. But it wasn't just the house that was abandoned. It was as though the very history of the mansion had been forgotten, left to rot in the shadows. They made their way to the library, the room that had housed the book. As they walked through the grand hallway, the walls seemed to close in on. The temperature dropped, and a sense of foreboding gripped their hearts. They had already uncovered the dark secrets of the Devereux family, but they still had no idea how to put an end to it. "Do you feel that?" Daniel whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "It's like something's watching us. Something alive." Margaret nodded, her throat tight. "It's the house. It's not just the mansion that's cursed. It's everything in it." They reached the library door, the massive wood frame creaking under their touch, as if it had been waiting for them. Margaret hesitated for a moment, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her, but she pushed the fear aside. They had come too far to turn back. Inside, the room looked almost exactly as they had left it. The same dusty shelves lined the walls, the same faint smell of old paper filled the air, but there was something different now, something palpable in the air. The book, the one that held the secrets of the Devereux family, was missing. "What the hell?" James muttered. "Where is it?" Margaret stepped forward, her heart racing. "It has to be here. It's the only way we can stop them." The group spread out, searching frantically through the piles of books, hoping to find something, anything that could explain the sudden disappearance. They pulled down volumes, flipped through pages, but the book was nowhere to be found. It was then that Margaret's eyes fell on a small locked cabinet in the corner of the room. It was old, covered in dust, and had never been noticed before. The brass lock gleamed faintly in the dim light. "I didn't see this the last time we were here," she said, pointing to the cabinet. James approached it cautiously, his hand lingering over the lock. "This could be it," he said. "Maybe whatever we need to stop the family is inside here." He pulled out a small key from his pocket, and with a trembling hand, inserted it into the lock. The sound of the tumblers clicking echoed in the silence, and the door creaked open. Inside the cabinet, they found something more terrifying than they had imagined. A collection of old yellowed letters. Some were handwritten, others were printed, but all were marked with the same family crest, the Devereux seal. Margaret's heart sank as she reached for the first letter, her hands trembling as she carefully unfolded. It was dated 1882, written in an elegant script that seemed far too precise for someone of common blood. The letter spoke of the family's pact, the blood sacrifices, the rituals, and most disturbingly, the creation of an object. The letter described it as a vessel, a physical manifestation of the family's immortality. The object had to be protected at all costs, because if it fell into the wrong hands, it would release something far worse than death. The teens exchanged nervous glances, the gravity of the situation sinking in. The object the letter spoke of had to be the same one that had haunted them for so long, the vessel that kept the Devereux family's dark power alive. As they read through the other letters, a pattern began to emerge. Each one described the creation of the object, the rituals required to maintain it, and the bloodline that was forced to uphold the family's cursed legacy. The Devereux family had given their souls to something ancient and dark, and now it was clear that no one, not even the family itself, was safe from its influence. James stood up, his face pale. "We need to destroy this thing. We need to find it and destroy it. Whatever this vessel is, it's the key to everything." Margaret nodded in agreement, but deep down she knew they couldn't do it alone. They would need to find someone who knew the family's history better than anyone, someone who could help them understand the full extent of the curse, and what they would have to do to break it. But the Devereux family was not going to let them leave that easily. As they turned to leave the library, the walls seemed to pulse with an energy they couldn't explain. A low hum filled the air, and they felt the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. Margaret's heart raced as she heard a voice, faint but unmistakable, whispering from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here." The sound of footsteps echoed through the hall, and the teens froze, the cold chill of fear settling in their bones. They were not alone. "Get out," the voice hissed, growing louder, more frantic. "You cannot break the family's legacy." The teens turned to face the source of the voice, but all they could see was a shadow, dark, swirling, and inhuman. It was then that they understood. The Devereux family had never left the mansion. They were still here, watching, waiting.
And they would stop at nothing to protect their legacy. The air grew even colder as the dark figure before them seemed to solidify. The mansion, which had already felt like a graveyard, now pulsed with a new life, one that was neither living nor dead. The presence of the Devereux family, though long gone in body, seemed to linger in the very air, an oppressive force that threatened to consume them all. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped backward, her feet stumbling over the uneven floorboards. Her hand found James's, and she gripped it tightly, hoping that whatever force had just spoken to them wasn't about to drag them into the abyss. "Who's there?" she managed to whisper, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to stay calm. The figure in front of them shifted, its outline growing sharper, more defined, until a pale face emerged from the shadows. A woman, or what looked like one. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and her features were gaunt, as though she had not seen sunlight in centuries. Her hair, dark and lifeless, hung in long, tangled strands around her face, and her mouth twisted into a cruel, knowing smile. "You are fools, to think you can undo what is already set in motion," the woman said in a voice that seemed to echo from every corner of the room, each word like a stone dropped into a deep well. "We don't want trouble," Daniel interjected, his voice barely a whisper. "We just need to know the truth. We want to stop this curse. We don't want to be part of whatever this is anymore." The woman let out a soft, chilling laugh. "You have no choice but to face the Devereux legacy. You already have blood on your hands. Your family was touched by it long ago, and now you must all pay the price." Her words were like daggers, and for a moment Margaret thought she might collapse under the weight of them. She had always felt a strange connection to this family, as if her very existence had been entwined with theirs in some inexplicable way. But hearing the truth, hearing the woman's confirmation of it, made her feel more lost than ever. She turned to James, seeking something, anything to hold on to, but his face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. It was clear that, like her, he could feel the crushing pressure of their family's history bearing down on them. "We were chosen," Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper. "That's why we found the book. We were meant to end this." The woman's gaze flickered toward her, her lips curling in a grotesque smile. "You were chosen, yes, chosen to suffer. You can never escape the Devereux bloodline, not while the vessel exists." "The vessel," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "Where is it? Where do we find it?" The woman's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing, as if contemplating whether to tell them the truth, or to let them continue stumbling in the dark. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice cold as ice. "Do you really think it's that simple? The vessel is hidden in plain sight, but it is not something that can be destroyed. It is not an object you can touch or burn. It is woven into the very fabric of your existence now. The Devereux family lives through you. It lives through every bloodline that's ever been touched by the curse." Margaret felt a wave of nausea wash over. The woman was speaking in riddles, but the implications were clear. They weren't just chasing an object, or trying to break a curse. They were part of something much darker, something that had been going on for centuries, and now it had woven itself into their very being. "Then why show us this?" Margaret demanded. "Why let us come here, dig up these secrets? Why let us even try?" The woman's eyes softened for a brief moment, almost as if she pitied them. "Because there is always hope," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And with hope, there is always the possibility of rebellion. Your ancestors tried to defy the curse, just as you do, but you can never truly fight it.
The Devereux bloodline is cursed, and it will always be cursed. With that, the figure started to fade, the dark shadows swallowing her up. The last thing Margaret saw was her cold, pitiless smile, and then, nothing. The room was silent again, the oppressive weight of the mansion's history hanging in the air like a cloud of smoke. Margaret stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. The curse wasn't just something they could defeat. It wasn't something they could run from. It had already claimed them in ways they could never escape. This can't be real, James whispered. We can't just be part of some family legacy of suffering. Here we have to find out more, Margaret said, her voice suddenly filled with determination. She felt the weight of their purpose settle over her like a mantle. They had come this far. They couldn't turn back now. Not when the truth was so close. Not when they could almost taste. But the way forward was unclear. They didn't know how to break the curse, how to rid themselves of the family's dark influence, or even what the vessel truly was. All they had were these letters, these cryptic messages from the past, and a sense that they were being drawn deeper into a web that had long been spun. We need to go back to the mansion, Daniel said, his voice filled with conviction. The answers are in there. We just have to find them. Margaret nodded. And when we do, we'll stop this. We'll find a way to end it once and for all. The group made their way out of the library, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them. But as they crossed the threshold, they felt the temperature drop even further. The air grew heavy with the presence of something unseen, something ancient and hungry. It was clear now there was no escaping the Devereux legacy. It was alive in every breath they took, every step they made, and it was waiting. As they left the mansion behind, they had no idea what horrors lay ahead, what price they would pay to uncover the secrets buried within its walls. But they knew one thing for sure. They would never be the same again. As the group made their way through the darkened hallways of the mansion, a sense of urgency took hold of them. Every step echoed through the silent halls, amplifying the heavy weight of their situation. The truth was tantalizingly close, yet each revelation only seemed to deepen the mystery. The woman's warning still rang in their ears. The vessel is woven into the very fabric of your existence now. Margaret had always felt an eerie connection to the Devereux family, but now, it felt as if the house itself were calling her, drawing her toward the answers she had desperately sought. The mansion, now no longer a place of mere history, had become a labyrinth of dark secrets waiting to be uncovered. Yet the deeper they ventured, the more they realized that these answers came with a price. What do we do now? Daniel asked, his voice breaking the silence. He looked at Margaret, eyes full of doubt, but also of determination. It was clear they had no choice but to keep going, no matter how much the mansion seemed to push them back. We need to find the vessel, Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the rising tide of fear that threatened to overwhelm her. The woman said, it's hidden in plain sight, but it's more than just an object. It's connected to us, our blood. It's in our family, in our bone. We need to find what that means. But where do we even start? James asked, his voice low and hesitant. We've been searching this place for hours, and it feels like the answers are slipping further away. Margaret thought for a moment, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. The vessel, the key to ending the curse, wasn't just something physical they could find. It was something deeper, something tied to their own bloodline, something hidden within the mansion's very walls. I think we're looking at it all wrong, she said, a sudden clarity coming over her. We've been so focused on finding an object, something tangible, but the vessel, it's not a thing we can touch. It's a part of us, and it's tied to the mansion in a way we don't yet understand. I think we need to look at this place differently. James and Daniel exchanged puzzled glances, but Margaret pressed on, her mind racing with new thoughts. The Devereux family didn't just hide the vessel, they built the mansion around it. The house itself is the vessel, the curse, the legacy. It's all tied to this place, and it's waiting for us to uncover it. They walked down a long hallway, the walls adorned with faded portraits of the Devereux ancestors. Their eyes seemed to follow them, the painted figures peering into their souls, judging them from beyond the canvas. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the very walls of the mansion were alive, watching listening, but she pushed the thought aside. They had no time to be afraid. They reached the grand staircase. Its once polished wood now worn and creaky, each step seeming to protest their presence. As they ascended, Margaret felt an undeniable pull toward the top floor, toward the rooms that had been off limits for so many years. She knew in her gut that the answers were up there, hidden behind doors they had never dared to open. With a deep breath, she led the way up the final set of stairs. As they reached the top, a cold gust of wind swept through the hallway, sending a chill down their spine. The doors at the end of the corridor stood closed, locked away for generations. Margaret approached the first door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. Before she could touch it, she heard a faint sound, soft, almost like a whisper, but too clear to ignore. "Turn back," a voice said, low and breathless. The air grew colder, the atmosphere thickening with an oppressive energy. "You cannot undo what is done." Margaret froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same woman they had seen earlier, her voice coming from nowhere, yet filling the entire hallway. The house itself seemed to be alive, warning them to stop. But Margaret couldn't stop. They had come too far, and there was no turning back. They had to finish what they had started. With trembling fingers, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, but Margaret could feel the presence of something ancient, something powerful, in the air. They stepped inside, and as their eyes adjusted, they saw what had been hidden for so long. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its frame covered in intricate carvings. The mirror's surface was cloudy, obscured by the years of dust and neglect. But as Margaret stepped closer, something shifted in the reflection. Her heart skipped a The woman from the paintings, the one they had seen in the mansion's earlier rooms, appeared in the mirror. Her eyes were dark and hollow, and her smile was twisted with malice. But there was something else in her eyes, something familiar, something that made Margaret's blood run cold. She was looking at herself. "Margaret," the woman whispered, her voice echoing in the room. "You cannot escape your bloodline." Margaret stumbled back, her heart racing as she looked at James and Daniel, who were equally frozen in shock. The woman in the mirror wasn't just some ghost or manifestation. She was a part of Margaret, a reflection of the curse that ran through her veins. "The vessel. It's you," Margaret whispered, the realization dawning on her like a hammer striking her chest. She staggered backward, her mind spinning as she tried to comprehend the truth. It was the house itself. It was not a physical object, but a living, breathing thing, and it was bound to their family. The vessel was the mansion. It was the source of the curse, and it was tied to Margaret, to her blood, to her family's very existence. "You were always meant to return," the woman in the mirror said, "and now, you will bring the family back. The Devereux curse will continue through you." Margaret felt a surge of terror, but also a deep, overwhelming sense of clarity. This was the key to ending everything. The mansion was alive with the curse, and now that she had uncovered the truth, she could finally end it. But doing so would come at a cost. She could feel the weight of her family's sins pressing down on her, and she knew that whatever choice she made would change everything. "We can stop this," Margaret said, her voice shaking but determined. "We can break the curse. We just need to destroy this place." But as the words left her mouth, the woman in the mirror began to laugh, her laughter echoing throughout the room. "You cannot destroy what is already part of you," she said, her voice filled with cold amusement. "The house has you. It always." Margaret turned to James and Daniel, her resolve strengthening. They had come this far, and they would not let the curse win. They would not let the Devereux legacy define them. "We'll destroy it," Margaret said, her voice filled with a newfound strength. "We'll break the curse, and we'll free this house from its dark grip." The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, the glass falling in 1,000 pieces around them. As the pieces scattered across the floor, the house seemed to groan, as though it were alive and in pain. Margaret didn't look back. She knew what they had to do now. As the last shard of glass from the shattered mirror hit the floor, an intense silence fell over the room. The air seemed to thicken, the oppressive weight of the house's secrets pressing down on them, like a suffocating force. Margaret felt her heart pounding in her chest, but she couldn't turn away now. They had broken the illusion, but that wasn't enough. The real battle had just begun. "We need to destroy it," Margaret said, her voice firm despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. She could feel the house stirring, responding to the disturbance. It wasn't just a home. It was a living entity, feeding off their every emotion, every action.
Home. It was a living entity, feeding off their every emotion, every action. James and Daniel exchanged uncertain glances. Their expressions reflected the doubt and fear that crept in like a slow poison, but they couldn't deny the truth they had just uncovered. This house, this cursed mansion, was tied to Margaret's bloodline. It had always been waiting for her to return, to unlock its darkest secrets, and now that she had, there was no going back. "What exactly are we destroying?" James asked, his voice shaking, trying to make sense of the chaos around them. "We've just broken a mirror. Are we supposed to burn the house down?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. Her mind was racing, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. She'd been drawn here for a reason, not by coincidence, but by design. She was the last heir to a family tainted by generations of darkness. Her blood had always been a part of this house, woven into its very foundations. "I don't think it's the house we destroy, James," she said slowly, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the room. "It's the curse. The house is just a vessel, a prison for everything the Devereux family has done, and we're supposed to just what?" Daniel interrupted, his voice rising with frustration. "We can't just walk out of here. The house won't let us go now. We've triggered something, and I can feel it. This place is alive." Margaret turned toward him, her expression grim but determined. "We have to find the heart of the curse, Daniel, the source of all of this. The house, it's just the shell, but deep beneath, in the very foundation of this mansion, that's where the truth lies. That's where the Devereux legacy, the curse, is rooted." Her words seemed to echo through the room, bouncing off the walls and making the very air seem thick and heavy with malevolence. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, broken only by the distant howling of wind outside. Then, without warning, the house seemed to groan, the floor beneath their feet creaking as though it were awakening, stretching after a long, uneasy slumber. "It's here," Margaret whispered, her eyes darting to the floor. "The foundation. It's calling us." Daniel stepped back, his face pale. "What do we do now?" Margaret didn't have an answer at first. She knew the truth. They couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until the curse had been severed, destroyed. She needed to find the source, the dark heart of the mansion that had been pulsing with the family's twisted history for centuries. "This way," Margaret said, her voice sharp with newfound clarity. She motioned toward a darkened hallway at the far end of the room. There, hidden beneath layers of dust and age, was the key to everything. The three of them moved quickly, instinctively, as though the house itself was urging them forward. The air was thick with the stench of decay and age, but beneath that, Margaret could smell something else, something bitter, something ancient. They reached the end of the hallway, where an iron door, half rusted and half forgotten, awaited them. The door, like the rest of the house, looked as though it had been sealed for generations. And yet, as they approached, it seemed to groan in protest, the hinges protesting, as if it were reluctant to be disturbed. Margaret reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal. The moment she made contact, a jolt of energy shot through her. She staggered back, her heart racing, and a flash of vision, of faces twisted in agony, of shadows moving in the dark, flashed before her eyes. She gasped, clutching her head. The vision was gone as quickly as it had come, but it left a lingering sense of dread behind. "We have to open it," Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper. Her hand shook as she touched the door once more, but this time it didn't push her away. Instead, the door opened slowly, creaking on its hinges, as if the house itself had been waiting for them. As the door swung open, the sight before them was not what they had expected. The room was vast,
but it was not filled with dust or debris. Instead, it was pristine, untouched by time. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with ancient tomes and jars of strange, unidentifiable substances. The floor was smooth and cold, and in the center of the room stood a stone altar, covered in dark, dried stains that looked almost like blood. It was here, in this room, that Margaret realized the truth. The curse wasn't just tied to her bloodline, it was tied to this altar, this place where her ancestors had performed their darkest rituals. "This is where it all began," Margaret whispered, her voice filled with awe and terror. She stepped forward, her heart racing, drawn to the altar, as if something were pulling her to it. James and Daniel hesitated, unsure of what to do, but Margaret couldn't stop herself. She reached out to touch the altar, feeling a strange warmth pulse from the stone. Her fingers hovered just above its surface, and as she did, the house seemed to respond. The walls trembled, the air grew thick with the sound of whispers, and suddenly, the room seemed to darken. The shadows on the walls stretched and twisted, forming grotesque shapes, eyes watching them from every corner. The air itself seemed to pulse, as if the house were alive and aware of their presence. "No," Margaret gasped, pulling her hand back. "This is it. This is where the curse began. We have to destroy this." James and Daniel stepped forward, their fear giving way to determination. They had no choice now. They had to end this. Suddenly, a loud, piercing sound echoed throughout the room, the sound of chains rattling, of something heavy being dragged across the floor. The walls seemed to close in, and Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The curse was awakening. They had to stop it. But could they? Could they truly destroy the source of the Devereux family's dark legacy? Margaret didn't know, but she knew one thing. The fight was far from over. The room grew darker, the shadows stretching and twisting into terrifying shapes. It felt as though the very air was alive, pulsating with an energy that wasn't human, wasn't natural. The sound of chains rattling grew louder, more desperate, as though something beneath the floor was trying to break free, to escape the confines of the house that had held it captive for centuries. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest as she turned to look at James and Daniel, who were standing close by, both visibly shaken, but determined. They knew they had come too far to turn back now. The curse had been set into motion the moment Margaret had touched the altar, and it was clear that the house would not let them leave until it had claimed its due. "We can't let this continue," Margaret said, her voice shaking with the realization of what was at stake. "We need to destroy it. Destroy the altar, the source of the curse. If we don't, it will consume us all. The house has been feeding on the Devereux bloodline for generations. We're the last to bear the mark. We need to end this." James nodded, though his face was pale and sweat beaded on his brow. "But how? What do we even do?" Margaret's eyes flickered to the shelves, lined with ancient tomes and jars. She could feel the weight of history pressing in on her, the presence of her ancestors, their sins, their sacrifices, all of it concentrated in this room. The power that had built this house, this nightmare, could not be easily undone, but she knew what had to be done. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice filled with a sense of urgency. "But I know that we can't let this curse continue to claim more lives. This altar, this is where it all began. It's where they performed their rituals, where they sealed their pact with the dark, and it's the only way to end it." Daniel took a deep breath and stepped forward, his hand resting on his chest, as if trying to steady his heart. "Okay, let's do it. We have no other choice." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settle into her bones. They had come this far, and they couldn't back down now. The curse had already taken too much from them, from the generations of Devereux, who had been consumed by it. If they didn't end it now, they would become just another chapter in the dark history of this house. But as she approached the altar, something changed. The air grew colder, more oppressive. The shadows seemed to gather, thickening around her like a living, breathing thing. The rattling chains grew louder, the floor beneath her feet creaking and groaning, as if it were alive, as if the house was protesting, fighting back against their intrusion. "Margaret," James called out, his voice rising with panic. He reached out to grab her arm, but she shrugged him off. "No," she said, her voice low but firm. "I have to do this. It's the only way to end it." Margaret reached out to touch the altar once more. As her fingers brushed the surface, a searing heat shot through her hand, as if the very stone were alive, burning her from the inside out. She gritted her teeth, refusing to pull away. This was it. This was the moment that would determine whether they survived or became another casualty of the house's cursed legacy. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind her. The walls trembled, and the air seemed to crack with energy. The shadows in the room began to writhe, twisting and pulling at the corners like tendrils of darkness coming to life. Margaret stumbled back, her heart racing in her chest. "What the hell is happening?" Daniel shouted, his eyes wide with fear. "We've awakened it," Margaret said through gritted teeth. "It's not just the curse that's bound to this place. There's something else. Something far darker, something that's been waiting for us." As she spoke, the shadows seemed to coalesce into a single massive form, rising from the depths of the room. It was as if the very house had come alive, its walls, floors, and ceilings converging into one monstrous entity, towering over them with an oppressive presence that filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The figure was monstrous, an amalgamation of human and shadow, its form shifting and undulating as if it were made of the very darkness that had been festering in this house for centuries. Its eyes, glowing red, bore down on them with a malice that made Margaret's blood run cold. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, its voice like the grinding of stone, low and menacing. "You cannot stop what has been set into motion. The curse will never die. The Devereux bloodline will never die." Margaret's heart skipped a beat as the figure's words echoed in her mind. The curse, it seemed, wasn't just tied to her family. It was tied to the house itself, to something far older and far more sinister. She had awakened something that was beyond her understanding, but she couldn't stop now. She had to finish what she had started. The figure moved closer, its twisted form closing in on them, the shadows licking at their heels. "No," Margaret said, her voice rising in defiance. "You don't control us. We're not bound to you." With a final desperate push, she grabbed hold of the stone altar, her hands burning with the heat that radiated from it. She didn't know what she was doing, but she knew she had to act fast. The figure was closing in, its red eyes gleaming with victory, but Margaret refused to let it win. The air in the room shifted again, growing thicker, heavier. The chains rattled louder, the darkness pressing in on them from every direction. But Margaret held on. She refused to let go. The house, the curse, it was all coming to a head, and it had to end now. With all her strength, Margaret pulled herself away from the altar, her hand slipping from the burning stone. The figure recoiled, howling in rage, as the darkness around them seemed to shudder and break apart. The shadows began to dissipate, retreating into the walls, the figure fading into nothingness as if it had never been there. The air cleared, the oppressive weight lifting from the room. Margaret felt her knees give out, and she collapsed to the floor, breathing heavily, her heart pounding in her chest. The house was silent now. The chains, the whispers, the shadows, they were gone. But was it really over? Had they truly broken the curse? "Margaret," James's voice broke through her thoughts, filled with relief and fear. He rushed to her side, kneeling beside her. Did we do it?" Margaret nodded, though her head felt foggy, as if she wasn't sure whether she was still dreaming. "I think so," she whispered, "but I don't know. I think we've won for now." As the last of the darkness receded into the walls, Margaret glanced at Daniel, who stood behind her, equally shaken but resolute. "We've faced the house," he said quietly, "but I have a feeling that the story's far from over." The air was still as Margaret, James, and Daniel stood in the center of the room, the oppressive energy of the house lifting. Yet, despite the silence, an unsettling feeling lingered. The house had released its hold, but something about the way the walls seemed to pulse, like the faint beat of a heart, made Margaret uneasy. She felt as if the house had simply shifted its focus, waiting for the right moment to strike again. It had taken everything in her to confront the entity that had haunted her family for generations, to fight the darkness that had soaked into the very foundation of this house. They had destroyed the altar, the physical embodiment of but something deep inside her knew that the real battle had just begun. Margaret shook her head, trying to clear the fog in her mind. "It's not over, is it?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. James, who had been staring at the now quiet altar, slowly turned to face. His expression was grim. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but something feels wrong, like we've only scratched the surface." Daniel stood near the door, his hand resting on the cold metal of the knob. "We've faced it," he said, his voice low, "but I think it's been waiting for us, playing its game. The house, the curse. It's not about breaking it. It's about the struggle, the inevitable fall. This was never meant to end easily." Margaret glanced around the room, as though expecting something to spring from the shadows, but the room was empty now. No more whispers, no more chains rattling. Even the air had changed, as if the house had breathed a sigh of relief, or perhaps it was just waiting for them to make a mistake. She rubbed her temple, the weight of the past few hours settling in on her shoulders. They had walked into the heart of a nightmare, and though the figure, the force that had haunted them, had retreated, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly free. How could they be? This house had stood for centuries, its walls had witnessed horrors, and its foundation had soaked up blood. Her family's blood. The curse may have been weakened, but Margaret knew that some things were too deep, too ingrained in the fabric of this house, to simply vanish. She was reminded of the final words spoken by the figure before it had disappeared into the ether. "You cannot stop what has been set into motion." That warning, that dark certainty, gnawed at her. Could they really undo the wrongs of generations? Could they ever truly escape the house's grasp? "We need to leave," James said suddenly, as though reading her thoughts. "We can't stay here anymore. It's over for now, but we need to get out of here." Margaret nodded, but a part of her hesitated. What if they missed some? What if the curse had a final card to play, one that would unfold in the quiet moments after they left the house? "What if we don't know everything?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What if there's more we're not seeing? This house is too old, too full of secret. Can we really just leave it behind?" Daniel stepped forward, his face hardening with resolve. "We don't have a choice, Margaret. The house has given us a chance to escape. Maybe it's waiting for us to make the right choice, the choice to walk away." For a moment, they all stood in silence, each of them processing the magnitude of what they had just done. They had broken the curse, but they had also uncovered a history too dark to ignore, too twisted to forget. The house had been built on secrets, and even now, those secrets had not been fully revealed, but the answers were buried beneath layers of fear and time, locked away for a reason. "Let's go," Margaret said finally, taking a deep breath. "It's over for now, but there's no point in tempting fate. We don't have to understand everything, we just have to survive." The three of them walked toward the door, each step a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. As the last footstep echoed in the hallway, the house seemed to let out a long, mournful sigh, a final warning, or simply the house's way of bidding them farewell. Margaret didn't look back as the door swung open, and they stepped into the quiet night. The weight of the house's secret seemed to lift, if only for a moment. The wind whispered through the trees, a gentle reminder that though they had won this battle, there were still many more to come. But for now, they were free. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more mysteries that will keep you on the edge of your seat.